Last time we did this, and I say we as BCS, we talked, it was about 2 weeks ago, we talked about coping with COVID and practically speaking, what do we do with the stimulus check and any questions around that? That is now online at our YouTube channel. So if you're thinking, I missed that, what was that particular? Go to BCS's YouTube channel and you can listen to that. It's about 36 minutes long, I think. Where we talked about what to do with the money, practically speaking. How do we manage life during a really fascinating time in history? And we also talked about resetting the family vision, which most of you are familiar with Restart and meeting with me. You've probably heard me use that language before. And then kind of healthy dialogue at home. Like, how do we manage this when our typical routines, patterns, opportunities are really, really different? What does it look like? And those last 2 points is I'm going to unpack more of those in more detail to hopefully give us a greater, stronger framework to approach life moving forward. And I'm hopeful that it will actually be really, really helpful. All right, so I'm going to open up an word of prayer and then a quick little devotional, because anytime I talk about money, I need that, and I do that even at home. Whenever my wife and I get into not like a 30-second check-in, but if we're going to talk about budget, if we're going to talk about planning, we always pray because we need help in that area. So I'm going to go ahead and pray, and then we'll do a quick devotional on a couple thoughts I've been having recently, and then we'll go ahead and dive in. Lord, good morning. Thank you for a chance to get together and talk on a Saturday morning when it's a little bit drizzly out. Though it's cloudy, maybe a little bit cold, a little bit wet, may our time together be encouraging, helpful, uplifting, and thought-provoking towards things that really matter and practical actions for us. Lord, we ask for help in Jesus' name. Amen. So a couple of thoughts briefly around vision planning steps. And I was looking at Proverbs. I do that occasionally as I'm talking with families about really specific things. And there's a couple of different passages I want to highlight. In Proverbs 6 to 11, 21, Proverbs 21, verse 17 and 20, and then again in Proverbs 23, 1 to 8, there's this consistent idea around thoughtful, careful living and being careful the kinds of pursuits that we have. Some of those passages talk about pursuing riches is like chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes talks a lot about that. And then there's being careful about trying to live in poverty so that whether you have riches or poverty, you're not being so self-centered that you miss out on what's been given to you. And so there's a tension of in Proverbs in being wise and thoughtful, generous without being gluttonous or self-depriving unnaturally so. And coupled with that, I want to share with you one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis, who wrote many books, particularly one of them sticks out in this conversation called The Weight of Glory. And he's talking to Christians, but I want you to think about what he's getting at, particularly in terms of how do we thrive in the midst of constricting situations. He says, indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, he's talking about the New Testament, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child, and listen to this, who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea, we are far too easily pleased. And that is kind of the springboard into our question that I posed, or the topic that hopefully we can think about is, how do we thrive amidst external constrictions and impositions? Because though we are currently experiencing COVID, there will be other versions of and situations where there'll be restrictions imposed against what we would typically want, whatever form that will take. If you've lived long enough, you've experienced more than one version of what we're currently going through, although maybe not to the degree. And how do we, in the midst of that, work towards, specifically speaking, financially, freedom, steps, practicalities, despite those circumstances? And how do we control or shape our thoughts and actions around money? And I want to first start by answering that question with, I think, the first step towards thoughtful, careful living and thriving in the midst of this situation is to make our world smaller. I think way too many of us have a temptation to consider what's happening in the Middle East while considering what's happened in China, while considering what's happening in North Africa or Southeast Asia or wherever, and then try and consume all that and work with it and try and figure out how do I deal with all that. Though I encourage people to be informed, I don't think it's wise to try and take the whole world, what's happening, and try and carry that weight. So I encourage us to make our world smaller, focusing on who's in front of me now. What are my responsibilities in front of me? Especially when it comes to what are we listening to and who are we listening to? And the ability to make our world smaller is actually the practical concept of controlling the controllables. Anxiety, worry, and fear come from when we begin to think about things that are outside of our control or influence. If we want to push back against anxiety, fear, and worry, we make our world smaller by focusing on what we can actually control and directly influence. It's really difficult to be effective today in life when you're worrying about what may or may not happen in the economy in the next couple of months, which, by the way, is up to none of us. And we will be the recipients of what comes from that later. But what we can focus on now is how we think about what we are currently doing. And so we can control what we think about. We can control our feelings, and particularly when our initial feelings come up, we might not be able to control those, but what we do with those feelings, we absolutely can control. We can control our responses to things and what we say, our direct actions. So that's what I mean by making our world smaller, is to be able to really focus on the things that are in front of us that we do have control and ownership over. I also encourage, as a practical piece of this, is limit the intake and the sources of the information that we are being exposed to. I do not encourage to scroll endlessly on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or whatever the news feeds are on your phone, because that will A, drive you nuts, give you a really weird view of life, and then mess with how you and I look at what we're supposed to do with what's in front of us. And one question I'd like to pose for us to think about is who, what, and from where do you want to be influenced by? Because we're all influenced by lots of things, lots of people in lots of ways, but there's to a lot of degree we can control that. And so if you spend an hour on Facebook, I'm just going to use that as an analogy, you may not necessarily do that, and you walk away from that and you feel really down, depressed, maybe you threw in a few cat videos to kind of lighten the day a little bit, or some funny memes that somebody posted on comparing Star Wars with the current COVID situation. My guess is that will have an emotional impact on you, which then colors how you look at your current situation or the rest of the day. Probably not that wise. Spending an hour to 2 hours on CNBC, Fox, CNN, all of the other news channels, New York Post, Washington Times, New York Times. We need to limit the amount of information that we're coming through. Now then the subsequent question is, well, okay, how do I pick between all that? Well, part of that is just your own preference. And then part of that is just like, who's actually telling truth? Well, again, that's a challenge because there's the idea of fake news and so on, but my encouragement is just to be really thoughtful about how you go about looking for those sources and find your information in places that are actually rooted in truth. We talked a lot about that last time, 2 weeks ago. And the ability to kind of have a healthy dialogue at home is first kind of understanding, like, what does it mean to have a healthy conversation at home, and how do we thrive in the midst of circumstances that are outside of our control, and how do we be better stewards? So some of you are going to say, uh-oh, he's using words that we talked about in Restart. Yep, I'm going to be piggybacking on some of that stuff, going a little bit deeper. So in terms of how do we look at health and stewardship, I think understanding stewardship is really important. And another way to talk about stewardship is management. So how we manage what we've been entrusted with. And particularly in two ways. And again, if you've taken Restart, this is language is going to sound really familiar to you, but the idea of cultivating and protecting. We have healthy boundaries, we have proper systems in place to manage what we've been entrusted with, and we feed those systems and boundaries with good, healthy things, then it grows and flourishes. So the example I use in the class is you put a plant in a pot and it's got, in some part, healthy boundaries, right? It's the pot itself is the boundary. And then if you give proper nutrition to it, proper watering, proper sunlight, you keep cats and small animals and small children away from it, it's got a pretty good shot of living. But if you take that same plant, take it out of the pot and throw it in the middle of the living room floor and see what happens, my guess is it's not going to do that well. So part of stewarding and managing is the blend of having proper boundaries and the proper nutrition or ingredients to add to the process of stewardship so that what you are managing grows and flourishes. And the better that we steward, the better that return on the investment is. So the better that we manage our time and our resources financially, relationships, that will in itself give a great return on what we've got to work with. And that's the stewardship piece. The health piece, I think, is built on, and I'm talking health generally, not necessarily something specific at this point, which we'll dive into in a minute. But health is built on proper systems and plans with proper ingredients, actions. This is a little high level. I'm going to land this in a few minutes, so hang with me here. Then when you apply this process, systems and plans, ingredients and actions, management, stewardship, to a vision or direction or trajectory, we begin to thrive. There's purpose behind the steps and actions that we're taking. So think about, I'm going to use an analogy here. Think about making a cake for an occasion. If you've ever done that, let's just go with the good experience, not necessarily the terrible experience. So the goal at one level is for the cake to taste good, hopefully. So in order to do that, you have to have good ingredients. But then you have to add the right ingredients with the right amount at the right time. So there's a process there to work through in order for a cake to taste at all interesting. But the actual purpose of the cake is much more than tasting good. It's actually adding to the enjoyment factor of the broader context, namely the occasion for celebration. So if the cake is good, but everything else is terrible, the impact will be dramatically decreased. So for example, if the cake tastes really good, but there's no decorations, nobody shows up, and not everyone shows up that you're hoping to show up to the party or the event, and then those that do show up are quarreling and fighting, and then the cat knocks over something and breaks, and like the whole event, even if the cake is awesome, is just wrecked. But if the cake is good, and everything else is great, then it adds to the enjoyment by a much bigger multiple than it could in and of itself. So when you look at, and I'm going to switch gears a little bit, when you look at your own personal financial situation in light of the current social dynamic, the context that we've got, when you look at your savings and your debts and the goals around those, that's the cake in this analogy. But what is the broader occasion? And I would argue that's what it is that we're living for and working to become. So the occasion in this case is the family vision. Now, again, if you've taken Restart or you met with me, you'll be familiar with that language that I love to use. So the broader context is the occasion for us is what's the vision, the trajectory, where we want to go and who we want to become. And those are underlined or undergirded by the values and the expression of those values, practically speaking. What is it that you want that to look like? So for example, there are iliads of values that are at play in our particular situations, things like generosity, hospitality, travel, relational connections, reading together as a family, camping, nature walks, going to plays. Like this list just can go on and on and on and on. But the blend of those values that we have at play create the occasion. And given that, what systems and plans do we need to implement or change in light of our unique situation, context, family dynamic, in order for us to actually pursue the family vision? So specifically would be the goals. So for example, in the analogy of the cake, bringing it to a party, the cake or the goals are, you want a tasty cake. You would like the decoration to be applicable. If there's going to be music, you want to be the right music given who's coming and what the occasion is. You want everything that tastes good. You want the whole vibe of the situation to be really good. Those are specific goals that put together will create an amazing experience. The same thing is true when it comes to our family vision. When we have proper savings goals, trying to get out of debt, proper management of the money, and the other components, that creates the ability for the family vision to flourish. So how do we prioritize these? What system, plan, strategies do we need to create to start going after them? Now, keep in mind what I said a little bit earlier about how do we thrive in the midst of constricting circumstances, whether it's self-imposed or, but in this case, externally imposed. It's making our world small. So focusing on those goals that we can actually pursue and attain, and keeping it small and manageable. And so some of the systematic things, the planning things, would be something like yearly vision casting days, monthly budget meetings, date nights, family meetings, adjusting timelines of goals, changing the scale of the goal. Particularly now, I'm beginning a lot of questions around how do we do hospitality when it's what we really enjoy doing, when we can't have people over into our homes or we can't go to people's homes. How do we do that? And so we brainstormed a little bit, myself and this couple, about what's the root of hospitality? Well, it's enjoying space, it's serving one another, it's creating an opportunity for connection, and to help relieve suffering if that's the case. And so one of the ideas that we came up with was, well, what if we bought prepackaged snacks, put them on our front porch or front doorstep, so that when a delivery driver comes, there's a little note there that says, hey, thanks so much for what you're doing, for allowing me to stay home and bring my stuff to me. Hope this treat is just a small testament to my gratitude to what you're doing. Simple, And it's a form of hospitality, although quite a bit different than having that person in your home and cooking them a meal. It's getting at the same idea. Some of you, if you were on 2 weeks ago, heard me talk about happy hour. I've been to several of those in our neighborhood now in the last couple of weeks. And so in our case, we had 6-ish feet distancing. Kids were running around. Adults had drinks of various kinds, and we were talking for an hour and a half. I did that a week and a half later with another couple in their part of the neighborhood, met some new people. So yeah, hospitality looked a little bit different there, but it's still possible to do. Because it just took a little bit of creativity to kind of tease out some of those practical steps and living out values in a clear way. And so you've got the occasion, family vision, or the party. You have the goals, which would be the cake, the decorating, the music, things tasting good. Financially speaking, it's building savings, paying debt down, getting current on bills, be able to do trips together, making memories as a family, saving for retirement, kids' college, saving to buy a house, starting a business, volunteering. Like this list can just kind of go on and on. Now that's got to land somewhere practically and specifically speaking. And that's the daily decision making. That's the right ingredients with the right amount at the right time. I'll say that again. It's the right ingredients with the right amount at the right time. If you've ever baked anything or made anything before, you know what happens if something calls for salt and you pour in a wee bit too much. It's really difficult to fix that. Or if you're baking cookies and you forget to add vanilla and you go to eat that thing, like something's off. It's not as good as it could have been. So we know that when we have any kind of baking experience, when there's the right ingredients, the right amount at the right time, you get this amazing combination. And so the question is, do we have the right ingredients? Are we putting in the right amount? And are we doing it at the right time? So practically speaking, let's walk through a little bit of a list here. Again, now I'm going to transition to our finances in terms of the backdrop of thriving with constrictions. So if, for example, like if the income has been affected during this time, then it might be, and I talked a little bit about this 2 weeks ago, might be calling the lenders, the people that there are bills to, and ask for a reduced interest rate, might be asking for deferment. It might be focusing on, okay, paying extra on this bill because it's got higher interest. It could be calling your utility companies and asking for financial help. It could be getting on equal pay or auto pay. Those are kind of the practicalities, some of the specifics. It could be reducing the cell phone plan, changing your garbage service, eliminating digital subscriptions, excuse me. Usually at this point, I see people start to squirm when I'm doing this in person with families. Like, wait. You talking about Hulu, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, Spotify, Pandora, Adobe, like whatever the connections are. You're really asking me to stop doing that, especially since I can't go anywhere? Yes. Again, right ingredients with the right amount at the right time. It could be reducing insurance or calling insurance company and saying, hey, I'm not driving hardly at all. Is there a program that's mileage based, or is there a way to pause or reduce it because I've driven 5 miles in a month? Looking for free trials, free events. The idea, what I'm getting at, are what are the different practical daily things that when we mix all this together, create the opportunity to pursue savings goals, to pursue debt goals, to pursue the specific goals that you've got in place so that we can live out the family vision clearer sooner. Appropriate spending boundaries. Now, this is actually kind of easy right now because we can't do the typical stuff that we would typically do. So I'm hearing a lot from families that we were just not spending as much. Great, take advantage of this time and repurpose that money towards something more interesting, namely, what goals are the most pressing? How do I break down the vision and make my world smaller so that I can actually get the financial traction that I wouldn't otherwise be able to get, especially because we're not traveling as much, hardly at all. We're not spending nearly as much out on extracurricular stuff. So there's built-in margin, not to mention the stimulus money that showed up for most people in the last week. So setting boundaries around food, clothing, eating out, that's fairly easy right now. Entertainment, again, think digital subscriptions at this point. Putting limits on pets, how much we spend on pets, if you've got pets. Kids' activities, parental spending money. This list could go on and on and on depending on our unique setup and situation. What is the savings plan, the specifics? Do we have that monthly plan budget in place? If it's an income issue, it's tricky right now, especially with the job loss. There are many families at BCS that have lost jobs. Others not affected at all. Tracking the money. I mean, this is probably one of the most overlooked specific things that we could do, but it actually gives us super clarity on where the money's going, how is it being used, and where am I at in relationship to the month, where am I at in relationship to the progress towards the goals and debts and so on. And then communication. How often are we communicating with our family or spouse or partner about where we're at? I often hear families say, yeah, we kind of do the once a month budgety thing. Some families say, we did our budget like 3 years ago. Okay, let's do one now. So how frequently should families or couples communicate about money? That's almost like saying, how frequently should we brush our teeth? Well, the more you do it, the cleaner the teeth become. The more you communicate about the financial situation, the healthier it will be, assuming, this is a big assumption, that how you're communicating about it is healthy, which I'm not going to get into now, but assuming that there is some level of health in that communication, the more that you do it, the more you'll be able to be specifically on the same page, which then, as you do these kinds of things or add more, it allows you to pursue the goals, which as you pursue the goals, it allows you to live out the family vision. So going back to that cake analogy, when you put in the right amount of sugar, the right amount of butter, the right amount, and on and on and on, and the timing and the amounts and the right ingredients, you bring that to the occasion, and then you add the other parts of the occasion, like the decoration, like the music and the place settings and so on, the lighting and so on. That then creates a wonderful, beautiful occasion. It's the same process about how do we thrive in the midst of constricting circumstances. We make our world small. We focus on those ingredients. We really nail that. And then as we add that to the bigger parts of our plan, it creates a stronger, more dynamic, more enjoyable situation. And so as we work this process, we live out proper stewardship, which leads to healthy living, which then leads to financial freedom, and that in turn leads to thriving. And in my view, that's how we answer that question of how do we thrive in the midst of constricting circumstances and situations, is that we make things really, really small and we focus on the things that we can actually do. So that's a little bit of a higher level, less specific approach, but this is the season that we're in is really quite a gift to us because it allows us, or it creates the opportunity, I would say, to step back and really reevaluate what it is that I am trying to pursue. Again, besides trying to keep the lights on, practically speaking, to do exist, where is this headed? And why do we want to go there? I think this season, because we're less busy, at least there are less external things that we're going to, there might be more of these things that are happening. Are they heading in the direction we want them to go? And are we being thoughtful about, in this season, how do we recalibrate as a family to head where we want to go? That's kind of what I had to chat with you all about. I'm still waiting for any questions. Now would be a great time. If you're like, okay, that's nice, Dino, but what about this? Or can you unpack that a little bit more? Anything along those lines, you can put it up in the chat as well. Or since there's just a few of us, if you want to unmute your mic and ask the question, feel free to do that too.
Okay, Dino.
Hi, Larry.
This was wonderful, very valuable. I loved your cake analogy in the context of having a party where multiple things make the cake. Ingredients and timing make the cake good, but the cake is part of a bigger context where if people don't show and people are arguing, the party's ruined, whether the cake is good or not. Great analogy for everything in life. If I wanted to listen to this a couple more times, has this been recorded?
Yes.
Wonderful. Good. Thank you.
Sure. So a question that somebody posed, is there a link to the YouTube channel? I don't have the link specifically, but I believe if I'm writing this in now, if you go to Birch Community Services, just go to YouTube/Birch Community Services, it'll show up. Okay, oh, somebody already put it up. Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca. Wondering about brainstorming ideas around generosity with more limited resources and social distancing. Yeah, we only have so much to work with. Even in the best of situations, we have, this is going to sound really trite, we have what we have to work with. And so part of the creativity factor is, how do we be generous with limited resources? And part of that, how do we be generous, is driven by how do you express generosity? Are you word-based? If you're more word-based, this is easy. This is about writing letters. It's about writing poetry. I mean, if you do that, I don't, but I would love that. Notes of encouragement. If you're word affirmation driven or word driven, this is a great time for you to do handwritten notes, practice calligraphy, and so on. If you're more like, my handwriting looks like a chicken crossed with a squirrel, not doing that, and I need contact, I need people, then it might be going on walks with people where you have more space. My wife has done multiple park outings with families, yet they're going to a place that gives more space, so you don't feel constricted and refined. So that's one part, and that really doesn't cost any money other than a little bit of gas, and you do a picnic lunch. So she's done lots of that. We've done multiple in our neighborhood. We've done multiple walks, more than we've typically ever done, and going around to neighbors and just slowing down to have conversations. Whereas before, we had hardly any conversations with neighbors because people were go, 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 go. Now everyone's lives are slower, and so we're having a lot more conversations. So those would be a couple of ideas that, off the top of my head, how generosity looks. My wife has also done, I keep saying my wife because she does this during the day and I'm working during the day. She will leave the kids with me while I'm working and watching them at the same time, and go and buy groceries for the at-risk, or the typical at-risk populations, and deliver it that way. So those would be a couple of things that we've done that hopefully might be helpful. So a question that was talking about the stimulus check is an advance on your refund for next year. At the moment, I've talked to a CPA about this. Money Magazine is all saying this is not taxable income, and it's not a forward or an advance on next year's tax credit or next year's taxes. I've also heard from people like Clark Howard at clark.com talk about that the law is actually a little fuzzy, and that potentially it could be taxable, although right now everyone's saying it's not. So at this point, my understanding is that it is a gift and you do not have to pay taxes on it. Now, if you owe taxes from last year, let's say, I do not know if the stimulus check will be there. Question, do you have any suggestions for teaching our kids about good stewardship during COVID-19? Great question. My encouragement would be to continue to do what you've been doing. Though if you were typically talk to them about how to manage the money and they go to the grocery store, you're probably not doing much of that anymore. But you can still talk about any money that is being spent, and being able to show the kids, here's what we're doing during this time. Walk through what you're doing with the stimulus check. Now, if your kids are like 1 and 3, that's a lot harder to do. But if your kids are older, you can think about, here's what we got, here's what do you think we should do with it? Invite them into the conversation. If their age, my kids are 6, almost 3 and 1.5. It's hard to do that with the younger two, but the older one, we've talked about it with them. We're not spending as much money right now, so there's less dialogue happening. But when you're about to make a money transition, include them in the conversation and the thought process. Here's why we're doing this. What do you think? And as you tie your decision making to the specific goals, which are tied to the family vision, that 3-step process, you are teaching and coaching them how to be intentional and thoughtful about where the money's going,